Between 1862 and 1865, 14 children vanished from the Sacred Heart Orphanage in Pennsylvania. They weren't adopted or transferred. They simply disappeared from every record, as though they had never existed. Protestant families in the area were suddenly seen with Irish Catholic children, laboring on their farms, children who spoke with thick accents and bore the distinctive marks of life inside an institution. When questioned, the stories these families told never matched. The horrifying truth has been revealed in recently uncovered letters between the Mother Superior and Philadelphia's bishop. These children weren't missing. They were sold. Before we go further into the story of Sacred Heart Orphanage, understand this channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you're ready to uncover secrets that powerful institutions have tried to bury forever, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. And I want to know. Comment below and tell me what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to hear what truly happened to those 14 innocent souls? Let's find out together. The truth behind the missing children of Sacred Heart begins not with their disappearance, but with the desperate circumstances that first brought them to Pennsylvania's rolling hills. Lancaster County in 1862 was a patchwork of prosperity and prejudice. The fertile farmland produced abundant wheat and corn that fed Union soldiers in the Civil War, making Protestant, German, and English farmers wealthier than their ancestors ever dreamed. But prosperity brought problems. With so many young men off at war, farms desperately needed workers during the crucial planting and harvest seasons. The labor shortage was reaching a critical point, just as government contracts promised unprecedented profits to anyone who could meet the demand. Into this landscape of opportunity and desperation came Sacred Heart Orphanage, established in 1859 by the Sisters of Mercy from Philadelphia. The 3-story brick building stood on 40 acres of donated land, just outside the small town of Strasburg. Its Gothic Revival architecture rose like a Catholic fortress amid the simple Protestant meeting houses and Lutheran churches dotting the countryside. The building's pointed arches and cross-topped bell tower made it impossible to ignore. Exactly the point, and exactly what troubled many local residents. Mother Superior Catherine O'Malley, a sharp-eyed woman of 45, had arrived from County Cork 20 years earlier with nothing but fierce determination and unshakable faith. She spoke with the lilting accent of her homeland, but her business sense was purely American. Under her leadership, Sacred Heart had grown from housing 12 children to nearly 60 by 1862. The orphanage took in Irish Catholic children from Philadelphia's overcrowded tenements, as well as the offspring of Irish immigrants who had died building the Pennsylvania Railroad. Through treacherous mountain passes to the west, the children ranged from 5 to 16 years old, their faces marked by the distinctive pallor of institutional life and the hollow-eyed wariness of those who learned early that the world offered no guarantees. They wore identical gray wool uniforms, simple dresses for the girls, plain trousers and shirts for the boys, and attended daily mass in the orphanage's small chapel. The older children helped with cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the extensive vegetable gardens that helped feed everyone. Sister Agnes Flanagan, the orphanage's treasurer and Mother O'Malley's closest confidant, kept detailed records of every penny that entered or left Sacred Heart's coffers. Her ledgers, written in a precise Irish hand, documented the constant struggle to keep the institution solvent. The Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia provided some funding, but wealthy Catholic donors were few in Pennsylvania, and the ongoing war had made charitable giving even harder. By 1862, Sacred Heart was operating at a significant deficit, a fact that kept Mother O'Malley awake through long winter nights. The local Protestant community viewed the orphanage with suspicion bordering on hostility. The know-nothing movement had stirred anti-Catholic sentiment throughout Pennsylvania in the 1850s, and the Civil War had done little to ease those tensions. Protestant ministers regularly preached about the dangers of papist influence, and local newspapers printed letters complaining about the orphanage's foreign children and their allegiance to Rome. Some farmers refused to do business with Sacred Heart entirely, while others charged inflated prices for grain and supplies. It was into this atmosphere of religious tension and economic pressure that Father Michael Brennan arrived in the spring of 1862. The diocese had sent him to serve as Sacred Heart's chaplain and to help Mother O'Malley navigate the increasingly difficult financial situation. Father Brennan was a different sort of priest. Ambitious, charming, and possessed of a merchant's eye for opportunity. Unlike the elderly Irish priest who had served the orphanage previously, Brennan had been born in Philadelphia and understood the delicate balance between Catholic principle and American pragmatism. At 38, Father Brennan cut an impressive figure in his black cassock, his dark hair always perfectly combed, and his shoes polished to a military shine. He spoke without an accent, having been educated at St. Charles Seminary in Philadelphia, and he possessed the rare ability to make both Catholics and Protestants feel comfortable in his presence. Local Protestant ministers found him surprisingly reasonable, and wealthy German farmers discovered he understood their concerns about labor shortages and wartime production demands. What none of them realized was that Father Brennan's understanding ran deeper than mere sympathy. He saw opportunity where others saw only problems, and he began to develop a solution that would benefit everyone involved. Except, perhaps, the children of Sacred Heart Orphanage. The first sign something was changing came in late May 1862, when Mother O'Malley announced to the staff that several older children would be placed with local families to help with spring planting. This wasn't unusual in itself. Orphanages had long arranged for older children to work as farmhands or domestic servants. But Sister Agnes noticed the arrangements were being made personally by Father Brennan, rather than through the diocese's usual placement procedures. When she asked to see the paperwork, Father Brennan assured her he was handling all documentation himself to avoid burdening the diocese's overworked administrators. The morning of June 15, 1862, dawned gray and humid, with thunderclouds building over the Susquehanna Valley. Timothy Walsh, a red-haired boy of 14 who had been at Sacred Heart for 3 years, was helping Sister Margaret tend the vegetable garden when Father Brennan approached with a well-dressed Protestant gentleman he introduced as Mr. Ezra Hoffman, a prosperous wheat farmer from Lancaster Township. Timothy had been expecting this moment for weeks. Father Brennan had spoken to him privately about the possibility of working for a good Protestant family who would treat him fairly and pay wages to help support the orphanage. The boy was eager to contribute. He had watched Mother O'Malley's worried expressions during meals and overheard hushed conversations about unpaid bills and dwindling supplies. If working for a Protestant farmer could help Sacred Heart survive, Timothy was willing to make the sacrifice. Mr. Hoffman examined Timothy with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock. He checked the boy's hands for calluses, asked him to lift a bag of grain to test his strength, and questioned him about his experience with horses and farm equipment. Satisfied with what he saw, Hoffman nodded to Father Brennan and counted out 45 in gold coins, an enormous sum, representing more than most workers earned in 3 months. "The boy will work through harvest season," Hoffman said, his Pennsylvania Dutch accent thick with authority. He'll live in the barn loft with my other hands, and I'll send him back in November when the work is done." Father Brennan blessed Timothy and assured him he was performing a great service for both his faith and his country. The Protestant farmer needed workers to produce grain for Union soldiers, and Timothy's labor would help feed the brave men fighting to preserve the Union. Sister Agnes watched from the kitchen window as Timothy climbed into Hoffman's wagon with his few possessions bundled in a cloth sack. Something about the transaction troubled her, though she couldn't quite articulate what. Perhaps it was the speed with which everything had been arranged, or the fact Hoffman had paid in gold rather than the paper currency most people used during wartime. But Father Brennan seemed confident, and Mother O'Malley had approved it. So Sister Agnes pushed her concerns aside and returned to her ledgers. 3 days later, 16-year-old Margaret Connolly disappeared under similar circumstances. She was taken by Mrs. Sarah Zimmerman, wife of a prosperous German farmer, ostensibly to work as a household servant and help care for the Zimmermans' infant twins. Margaret was a bright girl with a gift for languages. She had learned Pennsylvania Dutch from German immigrants in Philadelphia and could read Latin well enough to assist at Mass. Mrs. Zimmerman paid $62 for Margaret's services, explaining she needed help urgently because her regular servant had run off to Philadelphia to work in a munitions factory. The pattern continued throughout the summer of 1862. Every 2 or 3 weeks, Father Brennan would arrive at Sacred Heart with another prospective employer. Always Protestant, always wealthy, always in desperate need of immediate help. The amounts paid grew larger as harvest season approached and labor became even scarcer. 13-year-old Patrick Murphy went to work for a merchant family in Lancaster for $50. 15-year-old Bridget O'Brien was placed with a banker's family in Columbia for $75. 12-year-old Sean McMahon, despite his young age, was taken by a mill owner who claimed he needed a boy to help with his horses. By September 1862, 8 children had been placed with Protestant families, and Sacred Heart's financial situation had improved dramatically. The orphanage paid off its debts, purchased new winter clothing for the remaining children, and even added a small addition to accommodate more orphans from Philadelphia. Mother O'Malley praised Father Brennan's success, and the Sisters of Mercy began to relax their concerns about the institution's future. But Sister Agnes continued to feel uneasy. She had noticed none of the placed children had written letters back. Unusual, since children placed in previous years had always maintained contact. More troubling still, when she tried to visit Timothy at the Hoffman farm, she was turned away at the gate and told the boy was too busy with harvest work to receive visitors. The breaking point came on a cold October morning, when Sister Agnes encountered Mrs. Hoffman at the Lancaster market. The woman was purchasing household supplies, and Sister Agnes approached to ask about Timothy's welfare. Mrs. Hoffman looked confused and claimed she had no idea what Sister Agnes was talking about. She insisted her husband had never employed any orphans from Sacred Heart, and that their farm workers were all local men, exempted from military service due to essential agricultural work. When Sister Agnes pressed the issue, Mrs. Hoffman became agitated and suggested the sister was mistaken about which farm Timothy had been sent to. But Sister Agnes was certain. She had watched Timothy leave in Ezra Hoffman's wagon, and she had Father Brennan's word the boy was working there. The contradiction made no sense unless someone was lying. That evening, Sister Agnes confronted Father Brennan in his small office behind the chapel. She demanded to know the truth about Timothy and the others, and insisted on seeing the written agreements documenting their placements. Father Brennan was initially dismissive, suggesting Sister Agnes was confused and had misunderstood Mrs. Hoffman's comments. But when the sister threatened to write directly to the bishop in Philadelphia, Father Brennan's demeanor changed entirely. His friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold stare that seemed to look right through her. "Sister Agnes," he said quietly, "you must understand these are complicated times. The war has created opportunities that good Catholics must be willing to seize for the greater good of our faith and our institution. Those children are safe and well cared for, and their sacrifice is ensuring Sacred Heart can continue to serve God's purposes." "What sacrifice?" Sister Agnes demanded. "What have you done with those children?" Father Brennan leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, considering his words carefully. "I have found them homes where they can contribute to the war effort while learning valuable skills from Protestant families who appreciate their labor. In return, these families have made generous donations to Sacred Heart that have secured our future. It's an arrangement that benefits everyone involved." But Mrs. Hoffman said, Mrs. Hoffman said what she needed to say to protect her family's privacy. Father Brennan interrupted. "The families who have taken our children value their discretion, and we must respect that. Some arrangements are best kept confidential, especially during wartime." Sister Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Father, are you telling me you have sold those children?" The word hung in the air between them like a curse. Father Brennan's eyes narrowed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an unmistakable threat. "I'm telling you, sister, that you have a choice to make. You can continue to serve God faithfully at Sacred Heart, focusing on your duties and trusting in the wisdom of your superiors. Or you can pursue questions that will bring nothing but trouble to this institution and everyone in it. The bishop sent me here to solve Sacred Heart's problems, and I have done exactly that. I suggest you remember where your loyalties lie." The winter of 1862-1863 passed in an atmosphere of uneasy silence at Sacred Heart Orphanage. Sister Agnes continued her duties as treasurer, but the joy had gone out of her work. She found herself studying the ledgers with new eyes, noticing patterns that had previously escaped her. The donations that had appeared so providentially during the summer all came from the same source. A vague entry labeled "Placement Services" that corresponded exactly with the dates children had been taken. She began to understand that what she had witnessed was not charitable placement, but something far more sinister. The children hadn't been adopted or even indentured in the traditional sense. They had been sold to Protestant families who needed workers but didn't want to pay full wages to adult laborers. The transactions were disguised as charitable arrangements, but the substantial payments made it clear Sacred Heart was running what amounted to a human trafficking operation under the cover of religious charity. The realization tormented Sister Agnes through the long winter nights. She had taken vows of obedience to her religious superiors, but she had also taken vows to protect the innocent children in her care. The 8 children who had disappeared the previous summer had been her responsibility, and she had failed them utterly. Their trust had been betrayed not by strangers or enemies, but by the very institution that had promised them safety and care. Mother O'Malley seemed genuinely unaware of the true nature of Father Brennan's arrangements. She spoke proudly of the orphanage's improved financial situation and praised the priest's success in finding good homes for the older children. When Sister Agnes tried to raise concerns about the lack of correspondence from the placed children, Mother O'Malley dismissed her worries with the explanation that Protestant families often discouraged their workers from maintaining ties to Catholic institutions. "Those children are beginning new lives," Mother O'Malley said firmly. "We must trust that God has guided them to where they need to be, and we must focus on caring for the children who remain with us." But Father Brennan was already planning to expand his operation. As spring approached, he began conducting what he called evaluations of the orphanage's children, assessing their physical condition, work skills, and temperament. He paid particular attention to children who had recently arrived from Philadelphia, newcomers who had few friends at the orphanage, and whose disappearance would be less likely to cause disruption. The priest had also begun cultivating relationships with a broader network of Protestant families throughout Lancaster County and neighboring counties. The success of his initial placements had created demand for more workers, and the approaching planting season promised even higher prices for healthy, trainable children. Father Brennan spoke of expanding operations to include children from other Catholic institutions in Pennsylvania, creating what he called a regional placement service that would benefit multiple orphanages while meeting the labor needs of Protestant farming communities. Sister Agnes realized she was witnessing the birth of a systematic trade in human beings, one that exploited both the desperation of Catholic institutions and the prejudices of Protestant employers. The Catholic orphanages needed money to survive, and the Protestant families needed workers who could be obtained more cheaply than adult laborers. Father Brennan had found a way to profit from both needs while maintaining a veneer of religious respectability. The psychological impact on the remaining children was subtle but unmistakable. They had noticed the older children who left for placements never returned or wrote letters. Unlike children placed in previous years, whispered conversations in the dormitories revealed growing anxiety about their own futures. The children began to see reaching their teenage years, not as a milestone toward independence, but as a sign they might be next to disappear. 10-year-old Mary Catherine Donovan, who had been particularly close to Margaret Connolly, began having nightmares about being taken away by strangers. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, crying for Margaret and begging the sisters not to let the Protestant men take her. When Sister Agnes tried to comfort her, Mary Catherine clung to her desperately and whispered, "They're not coming back, are they? Margaret and Timothy and the others, they're never coming back." The question haunted Sister Agnes, because she increasingly suspected Mary Catherine was right. The children who had been taken weren't being trained for independence or given opportunities for better lives. They were being consumed by a system that valued their labor more than their humanity. And once they entered that system, they effectively ceased to exist as individuals with rights and futures of their own. As the snow melted and the first signs of spring appeared in the orphanage gardens, Sister Agnes made a decision that would ultimately expose the full horror of Father Brennan's operation. She began keeping a secret record of every child who was placed, documenting their names, ages, physical descriptions, and the families who had supposedly taken them. She also began discreetly questioning recent arrivals from Philadelphia about any siblings or friends who might have been at other Catholic institutions in the region. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears and revealed that Sacred Heart's missing children were part of a much larger network of exploitation stretching across Pennsylvania and possibly beyond. In March 1863, as the Civil War entered its bloodiest phase, Father Brennan received an unexpected visitor who would ultimately unravel his carefully constructed network. Bishop Francis Kenrick of Philadelphia arrived unannounced at Sacred Heart, ostensibly to conduct a routine inspection of the diocese's rural institutions. But Sister Agnes quickly realized the bishop's visit was anything but routine. Bishop Kenrick was a stern, intellectual man who had risen through the church hierarchy by combining theological scholarship with administrative precision. He had been receiving troubling reports from other Catholic institutions across Pennsylvania, reports of children disappearing without proper documentation, and of suspicious financial windfalls that coincided with these disappearances. The pattern had finally become too obvious to ignore. Father Brennan received the bishop with elaborate courtesy, conducting a tour of the orphanage's improved facilities and praising the Sisters of Mercy for their dedication. He presented the financial records with pride, explaining how his innovative placement program had transformed Sacred Heart from a struggling institution into a model of efficiency. The bishop listened without comment, his pale eyes taking in every detail. But when Bishop Kenrick asked to see the documentation for the children placed with local families, Father Brennan's confident demeanor began to crack. He explained, the records were stored in a secure location in Lancaster and couldn't be retrieved immediately. He promised to have them available within a few days, but the bishop insisted on seeing them before his departure the following morning. That evening, as Father Brennan worked frantically in his office to create the required documentation, Sister Agnes made a decision that required tremendous courage. She approached Bishop Kenrick privately and requested a confidential meeting. The bishop, who had served in Pennsylvania long enough to recognize the signs of institutional corruption, agreed to hear what she had to say. In the orphanage's small library, with only a single oil lamp for illumination, Sister Agnes revealed everything she had discovered. She presented her secret records and described her encounter with Mrs. Hoffman. She explained her growing suspicions about the placement services and her fears for the welfare of the children who had been taken. Bishop Kenrick listened in grim silence as Sister Agnes detailed what amounted to a systematic slave trade operating under the cover of Catholic charity. When she finished, the bishop sat quietly for several minutes, weighing the implications. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. Sister Agnes, what you have told me represents one of the gravest scandals in the history of our diocese. If your suspicions are correct, Father Brennan has not only violated his sacred vows, but has committed crimes against both church and civil law. I want you to understand that pursuing this matter will likely result in the closure of Sacred Heart and significant damage to the church's reputation in Pennsylvania. Are you prepared for those consequences? Sister Agnes met the bishop's gaze without flinching. Your Excellency, I took vows to serve God and protect the innocent. Those children trusted us to keep them safe, and we failed them. If Sacred Heart must close to prevent this from happening to other children, then that is God's will. The bishop nodded slowly. Very well. Tomorrow morning, I will confront Father Brennan with your allegations. I want you to be present as a witness, and I want you to bring every document you have compiled. We will get to the truth of this matter regardless of the cost. But Father Brennan had not risen to his position without developing a keen sense of self-preservation. He had noticed the private meeting between Sister Agnes and Bishop Kenrick, and he correctly interpreted the sister's refusal to meet his eyes during evening prayers. That night, as the orphanage slept, Father Brennan gathered his most important documents and what money he could carry, and he disappeared into the Pennsylvania countryside. By morning, Father Brennan was gone, along with nearly 300 from Sacred Heart's treasury and all records of his placement operations. He had left behind only a brief note, claiming he had been called to serve as a military chaplain and would be departing immediately for the front lines. The note made no mention of the missing children or the families who had supposedly taken them in. Bishop Kenrick was furious at the priest's escape, but he was also relieved to have confirmation that Sister Agnes's allegations were true. Father Brennan's flight was as good as a confession, and it freed the bishop to take immediate action. He dispatched investigators to locate the missing children and began determining which other institutions might have been involved. What they discovered over the following weeks was a network of corruption that had exploited dozens of children across multiple counties. Father Brennan had been working with at least 3 other priests and had established relationships with Protestant families throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. The operation had generated thousands of dollars in illegal profits, while condemning vulnerable children to lives of unpaid labor and social isolation. But the investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. Several of the placed children could not be located at all. Some families had moved to other states, taking the children with them and leaving no forwarding addresses. Others claimed the children had run away or died from illness, but could provide no documentation. The trail of at least 6 children, including Timothy Walsh and Margaret Connolly, had gone completely cold. The discovery that several children remained missing transformed Bishop Kenrick's investigation from an internal church matter into a criminal case involving both state and federal authorities. The bishop realized some of the missing children might have been transported across state lines, making their disappearance a federal crime. In April 1863, as the investigation expanded, Sister Agnes received an unexpected visitor who would provide the first real breakthrough. Jacob Stoltzfus, a young Mennonite farmer from Lancaster County, arrived at Sacred Heart in obvious distress. He had heard rumors about the investigation and had come forward with information that could help locate some of the missing children. Stoltzfus explained that his family had been approached by Father Brennan the previous summer about taking in a Catholic orphan to help with farm work. The Mennonites, as a peace church, had maintained neutrality during the war, but had also experienced severe labor shortages as their young men left Pennsylvania to avoid the draft. Stoltzfus's father had been tempted but ultimately declined because the arrangement conflicted with Mennonite principles about treating workers fairly. However, Stoltzfus knew of other Mennonite families who had accepted children from Father Brennan, and he had growing concerns about their treatment. "There is a family in our district," Stoltzfus told Sister Agnes and Bishop Kenrick, "the Yoders, who took 2 children from your priest last summer, a boy and a girl, Irish children with red hair. The boy would be about 14, the girl maybe 12. They work from dawn to dusk in the Yoder fields, and they live in a shed behind the barn. My wife has seen them at the creek when she fetches water, and she says they look like they're afraid of their own shadows." Bishop Kenrick immediately dispatched investigators to the Yoder farm. What they found confirmed the worst fears about the fate of the missing children. The Yoders had indeed purchased 2 Irish children from Father Brennan, Sean McMahon and his younger sister Ellen, who had been taken from Sacred Heart on the same day, despite being only 11. The children were living in conditions that barely qualified as human, sleeping on straw in an unheated shed, working 16-hour days without pay, and forbidden to speak to anyone outside the Yoder family. They had been told Sacred Heart had been destroyed in a fire, and all the sisters had died, leaving them with no one to turn to. The Yoders had also threatened to turn them over to Union Army recruiters if they tried to run away, claiming Irish Catholic children were considered enemy sympathizers and would be imprisoned or shot. The discovery of Sean and Ellen provided the first concrete evidence that the placed children were being held in conditions of slavery. But it also raised terrifying questions about the other missing children. If the Yoders were willing to treat children so brutally, what might have happened to children sold to families with even fewer scruples? The investigation took on new urgency when Bishop Kenrick received a letter from the Catholic Diocese of Baltimore reporting similar disappearances from orphanages in Maryland. The letter described a network of priests selling children to Protestant families throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, with some children transported as far south as Virginia and North Carolina. The operation appeared much larger than initially suspected. Father Brennan had been just one participant in a regional conspiracy. As federal marshals joined the investigation, they began uncovering evidence of a sophisticated criminal network operating for at least 2 years. The conspirators had developed a system for identifying vulnerable children, creating false documentation, and moving them across state lines to families willing to pay premium prices for completely controllable workers. The network had generated tens of thousands of dollars in profits, while condemning hundreds of children to forced labor. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators located a farm in Chester County where 3 former Sacred Heart children had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The farmer claimed the children had died from fever during the harsh winter of 1862 to 1863, but the local coroner's examination revealed evidence of severe malnutrition and physical abuse. The children had been buried in unmarked graves behind the barn, their deaths unreported to any authorities. The farmer, a prosperous grain merchant named Samuel Crawford, initially denied any knowledge of how the children had died. But when confronted with the coroner's evidence and threatened with murder charges, he broke down and confessed. He admitted purchasing the 3 children from Father Brennan for $200, intending to use them as unpaid farm workers until adulthood. The children had been weak from institutional upbringing and struggled to adapt to harsh farm labor. Crawford claimed he tried to care for them when they became ill, but was unwilling to summon a doctor for fear of questions about their presence. By the time he realized how serious their condition was, it was too late. Rather than report their deaths, he buried them secretly and destroyed all evidence of their existence. The discovery of the 3 dead children sent shockwaves through the investigation and transformed public perception. What had initially been viewed as corrupt but minor scandal had become a story of systematic child abuse and murder. Newspapers throughout Pennsylvania began calling for immediate arrests, and political pressure mounted for a comprehensive federal investigation. Just when we thought we'd seen the full extent of this horror, the investigation took an even darker turn. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened when federal authorities finally tracked down Father Brennan and uncovered the true scope of his network. Federal marshals located Father Michael Brennan in October 1863 at a Union Army camp near Gettysburg, where he had been serving as a chaplain under an assumed name. The priest had grown a beard and claimed to be Father Patrick Murphy from the Diocese of Boston. But his distinctive Pennsylvania accent and knowledge of Latin liturgy eventually betrayed him. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, Brennan initially maintained his innocence, claiming he had been providing a valuable service to both the Catholic Church and Protestant families in need of workers. but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Federal investigators had documented at least 47 children sold through his network across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. They had traced financial records showing Brennan and his collaborators had generated over $15,000 in profits, an enormous sum representing more than most Americans earned in a decade. Under intense interrogation, Father Brennan finally confessed to the full scope of his operations. He revealed the network had been his own creation, born from his observation that Protestant families were willing to pay substantial sums for completely controllable workers. He had convinced other priests to participate by arguing the profits would help their struggling institutions survive wartime economic pressures. The children, Brennan explained with chilling matter of factness, were selected based on age, physical condition, and social isolation. Older children who could perform heavy labor commanded the highest prices, while younger children were sold to families needing domestic servants or help with lighter agricultural work. Children with no relatives or friends outside the institutions were preferred because their disappearance was less likely to be noticed. These children had no future anyway, Brennan told his interrogators with stunning callousness. They would have spent their lives in poverty, probably dying young from disease or industrial accidents. At least this way they served a useful purpose and contributed to the survival of Catholic institutions that could help other children. The priest's confession revealed locations where some missing children had been taken, leading to the rescue of 11 more former Sacred Heart orphans found working on farms across 3 states. But 6 children, including Timothy Walsh and Margaret Connolly, remained unaccounted for. Some had been sold to families who had subsequently moved west, taking the children to territories where federal authority was limited. Others had been sold to families who claimed the children had died or run away, but provided no credible evidence. The investigation also uncovered evidence that several children had been sold to families with intentions beyond labor exploitation. 3 children had been sold to a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who kept them as personal servants in his mansion, forcing them to work without pay while forbidding outside contact. 2 others had been sold to a Virginia plantation owner who used them as laborers alongside his enslaved African Americans, creating a grotesque situation where Irish Catholic children were held in conditions identical to chattel slavery. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that some children had been sold for purposes beyond labor. Federal investigators found evidence at least 3 children had been sold to buyers specifically seeking young servants for what documents euphemistically described as personal service. Reports suggested some missing children had been sold into sexual slavery. The full horror became clear when investigators realized Father Brennan had been operating what amounted to a catalog system for child trafficking. He maintained detailed records of available children, including ages, physical descriptions, work skills, and temperaments. Prospective buyers could review these records and select specific children who met their needs, with prices varying based on the child's age, health, and capabilities. Mother Superior Catherine O'Malley, when confronted with the evidence of what had happened under her authority, suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous collapse. She had genuinely believed Father Brennan was helping place children in good homes, and the revelation that she had been an unwitting accomplice to child trafficking destroyed her mentally and spiritually. She was removed from her position and spent the remainder of her life in a convent infirmary, never again able to speak coherently about her time at Sacred Heart. Sister Agnes, despite her efforts to expose the conspiracy, was consumed by guilt over her failure to act sooner. She had suspected something was wrong from the beginning, but her obedience to religious authority had prevented decisive action until it was too late to save most children. She left Sacred Heart shortly after the investigation concluded and spent the rest of her life working with freed slaves in the South, seeking redemption through service to other trafficking victims. The trial of Father Brennan and his collaborators became one of the most sensational criminal cases of the Civil War era. The federal prosecutor charged them under newly passed laws against interstate trafficking in human beings, arguing their crimes were comparable to the slave trade the Union was fighting to abolish. The defense attempted to portray them as misguided religious officials, trying to help children find better lives, but evidence of systematic exploitation was too overwhelming. During the trial, testimony from rescued children revealed the full extent of their trauma. Sean McMahon testified he had been forced to work 18-hour days during harvest and beaten with a leather strap whenever he showed exhaustion. Ellen McMahon described sleeping in an unheated shed during winter, sometimes waking to find ice on her blanket. Other children testified about being forbidden to speak their native language, denied medical care when ill, and threatened with violence if they tried to contact former caretakers. The most impactful testimony came from 12-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan, sold to a family in Baltimore County, Maryland. Bridget described being forced to work as a domestic servant from dawn until midnight, sleeping on the kitchen floor and given only scraps. When she tried to run away, she was captured and locked in a root cellar for 3 days without food or water. The family told neighbors she was a slow-witted distant relative requiring constant supervision, preventing anyone from questioning her treatment. Father Brennan showed no remorse during proceedings. When given opportunity to address the court before sentencing, he delivered a lengthy speech justifying his actions as necessary for Catholic institutions' survival during wartime. He argued Protestant families were providing children opportunities for useful work and Christian instruction they would never have received in Catholic orphanages. His only regret, he claimed, was not helping more children find productive lives outside the institutional system. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Father Brennan was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, while his collaborators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The judge described their crimes as a betrayal of everything civilized society holds sacred, and expressed particular outrage at their exploitation of religious authority to commit what he characterized as the most heinous form of slavery. Sacred Heart Orphanage never recovered from the scandal. The Diocese of Philadelphia closed the institution in 1864, transferring remaining children to other orphanages. The building was sold to a Protestant denomination and converted into a seminary, but that venture failed within years. Local residents reported the building seemed cursed, with strange accidents befalling anyone who tried to operate a school or religious institution there. For decades after, investigators continued searching for the 6 children never found. Timothy Walsh was reportedly seen working on an Ohio farm in 1867, but by the time authorities arrived, the family had moved without trace. Margaret Connolly was allegedly spotted as a servant in a wealthy Virginia household, but disappeared again before contact. The other 4 missing children simply vanished into post-Civil War America's vast anonymity. They may have been moved repeatedly between families, their identities changed and histories erased. They may have died from overwork, abuse, or neglect, their deaths unreported and graves unmarked. Or they may have survived to adulthood, forever carrying childhood trauma, but unable to return to stolen lives. The psychological impact on rescued children was profound and lasting. Many struggled with what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, nightmares, anxiety attacks, difficulty trusting authority. Several ran away from new institutions where they were placed, preferring streets over risking betrayal again by religious authorities. The scandal also had far-reaching effects on Catholic-Protestant relations. Protestant communities now had concrete evidence supporting fears about Catholic corruption and foreign influence. Catholic leaders struggled to rebuild trust with congregations and broader public. The case became a rallying point for anti-Catholic sentiment persisting well into the 20th century. Federal authorities used the case to justify expanded oversight of religious institutions and stricter enforcement of laws governing children in institutional care. New regulations required detailed documentation of placement arrangements and mandated regular inspections of families taking in children from orphanages. These reforms helped prevent similar large-scale trafficking, but came too late for Sacred Heart's 14 children. The question of what happened to the missing children continued haunting investigators. Federal Marshal James Crawford, who led the initial investigation, spent years following rumors and alleged sightings, but never found conclusive evidence. In his 1870 final report, he wrote, "The trail of these innocents has grown cold, and I fear the truth of their ultimate fate may never be known. They were consumed by a system that valued their labor more than their humanity, and they paid the ultimate price for our failure to protect them." Sister Agnes's secret records, instrumental in exposing the conspiracy, were preserved by the Diocese of Philadelphia and eventually deposited in the Pennsylvania State Archives. Researchers examining these documents later were struck by her meticulous care recording each child's name, age, and personal characteristics. Her notes revealed a woman who genuinely loved the children and was tormented by her inability to save them. The most haunting entry was her notation beside Timothy Walsh's name. Red hair, freckles, scar on left hand from kitchen accident, dreams of being a school teacher afraid of thunderstorms. Last seen June 15, 1862. God forgive us all. Similar personal details appeared beside each name, creating portraits of individual human beings reduced to commodities. The Sacred Heart building stood empty nearly a decade after the scandal. Local residents reported seeing lights in windows at night and hearing children's voices from empty rooms. Whether supernatural manifestations or products of guilty consciences and collective trauma, they served as constant reminders of the tragedy. In 1874, the building was demolished by new owners who claimed it was unsound and dangerous. But area residents knew the real reason. It had become a monument to shame no one could bear to see. Bricks were hauled away to build a new Lancaster courthouse, where they still serve as foundation for justice administration. The land was eventually converted to a public cemetery. A small granite marker erected in 1925 commemorates the exploited and lost children. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of the innocent children who suffered here. May they find in death the peace denied them in life." Even this modest memorial was controversial, with some residents arguing it would only remind people of a tragedy better forgotten. Father Brennan served 18 years of his 20-year sentence before dying in federal prison in 1881. His death certificate listed pneumonia, but prison records suggest declining health due to what doctors described as melancholia, possibly belated recognition of his crime's enormity. He was buried in an unmarked prison cemetery grave, his name deliberately omitted from memorial records. Other priests involved faced defrocking by the Catholic Church. Attempts to locate families who purchased children were largely unsuccessful. Many had moved to Western territories, where federal authority was limited. Children sold to these families disappeared into America's expanding frontier, their fates forever unknown. The Sacred Heart scandal contributed to significant reforms in religious institution operations. New laws required regular government inspections of orphanages and strict documentation for placement arrangements. These reforms helped prevent similar trafficking, but came at the cost of increased suspicion and regulation of previously autonomous religious charities. Perhaps the most lasting legacy was recognition that institutional authority, religious or secular, could not be trusted blindly regarding vulnerable children's welfare. The case demonstrated even respected religious figures could commit monstrous crimes when personal ambition combined with institutional power and social prejudice. The 14 children disappearing between 1862 and 1865 were victims of a perfect storm: wartime desperation, religious prejudice, economic opportunity, and moral corruption. Their individual stories were lost in larger narratives of American expansion and conflict. But their collective tragedy reminds us of the price innocents pay when society fails to protect its most vulnerable. 2. This mystery shows even our most trusted institutions can harbor darkest secrets, and the most innocent can fall victim to those exploiting vulnerability for profit. What do you think? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are secrets still buried in Pennsylvania's rolling hills? Comment below. Share thoughts on whether some children might have survived and lived unknown lives under different names. If you enjoyed this dark chapter and want more stories about secrets hidden in our nation's past, subscribe, hit notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries, making you question everything about history. Truth is always more complex and terrible than we imagine, and countless other stories wait to be told. See you next video, where we'll uncover another mystery powerful people hoped would stay buried forever.